All right, welcome everyone. Welcome back to another episode of the Polyglottal Stop, a podcast about language, language learning, and sociolinguistics from a polyglot's point of view. Today, we have a guest with us. We have Amarens, who is a content creator in the language space. Welcome, Amarens.
Thank you.
I'm so glad you were able to carve out some time from your schedule to be able to sit with us today. Please go ahead and introduce yourself. Tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do.
Yeah, thank you for having me. So my name is Amarens. I'm from the Netherlands and I studied linguistics and I'm still studying linguistics to be honest. Um, I am currently doing a master in something called voice technology. So it's kind of an intersection of, let's say, linguistics and technology.
Mm-hmm.
And as a student, also for years, I've been creating, let's say, blog content, language learning content, and starting, let's say, linguistic projects that kind of fall within, I don't know, what I'm interested in.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, that's.
It's awesome. Thank you very much. So you have two Instagram accounts, right? In that sort of language linguistic space, Untranslatable and Foreign Language Collective, if I'm
Yeah.
correct. Can you tell us a little bit about those?
Yeah. The Foreign Language Collective came first.
Okay.
And I actually had a different Facebook page before that. It all, I don't know, kind of just happened to me, but it was a page about, let's say, traveling and living abroad.
Hmm.
And for me, language learning was always a big part of that. But I realized that within my audience, that there was a distinct group of people who was interested in that language aspect and a group of people that wasn't. And so I made a separate page that was really dedicated to, let's say, the language aspect, but in, let's say, all of its forms. So like language learning, but also linguistics. Um, and
And
yeah,
that's how you got. That's what created Foreign Language Collective.
yes, yeah. And so the name is also quite broad because it was really just supposed to be about language, and it's mostly like sharing like memes and like blog articles and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And from there, I kind of got this idea for Untranslatable. And I kind of used the platform of the Foreign Language Collective to start that project
Mm-hmm.
and to do a Kickstarter and to raise money so I could like realize that project. So it's kind of a child of the Foreign Language Collective, so to say.
Oh, very cool. So, what is the Untranslatable project about?
So Untranslatable is a multilingual urban dictionary.
Mm-hmm.
Because as a linguist and a polyglot, I always found that like when you learn a language, it's often very formal.
Mm-hmm.
But when you live abroad or you have friends from abroad, you that kind of clashes because you don't really learn the language that they speak.
Yeah.
And there's not a lot of spaces online where you can actually look for those like slang words or where they're adequately explained. Because I feel
Yeah.
like sometimes you can find the meaning of something, but not like who uses it or where it's used,
Mm-hmm.
or
Or
sometimes a
if it's like
word.
age group specific or something like that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Yeah. Like sometimes I'll learn a word and I say, but is it weird for me to use it, or is
Mm-hmm.
that,
Yeah.
like how would that go? Or maybe country specific, like a word can have a very
Mm-hmm.
different meaning in each country. And
Right,
so
like the
you,
difference between Spain and Mexico, for example.
yeah, for
Yeah.
example, yeah. So if you like, I don't know, have a word that you're unsure what it means and you're trying to look for it, you might find a lot of meanings, but not the one that you're looking for because you're
Yeah.
specifically looking for, I don't know, someone from Colombia who said that word.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so that was kind of the idea of Untranslatable to create like a website where people can add, I mean, slang and expressions and just general like linguistics things,
Mm-hmm.
and kind of add a bit of a social linguistic element to it, like who uses it, what type of register is it,
Right.
but
That's
still
really
keep
cool.
it kind of, let's say, accessible to people who aren't familiar with
Right.
linguistics. So
Right.
it's really hard to kind of like, how do I phrase the question in a way that people are going to be able to answer it and like give information that would be very interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so that was kind of the idea behind Untranslatable.
That's very cool. I have been following Untranslatable
Mm-hmm.
and Foreign Language Collective, but I started following Untranslatable first. So I didn't realize that it
Oh,
was a
okay.
baby of
Yeah.
FLC, if I can call it that.
Sure, yeah.
And what I really liked about it was that idea that it's like, if you were to translate this literally,
Mm-hmm.
doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, no.
Um, and then understanding that, oh, okay, so this is what that means. And then the way that you have your posts, I think it's very easy to read. It's easy to like get the message. And I also like, and for anyone who is not currently following Untranslatable, it's at untranslatable.co on
Mm-hmm.
Instagram. I highly recommend it if you like language stuff, because it's bite sized, right? And my podcast has that same goal of being shorter and like to the point and get the message and move on. Go on with your day. One and I like that one of the types of posts you do is where you ask for input from others, right? So you'll say something
Yeah.
like in the air, and then like share your expressions using the word air, or things like
Yeah.
that. And the other day I was watching, must have been a Korean video on YouTube,
Mm-hmm.
and someone used the term menonim, menonim, and uh, that's something that I don't think is in the dictionary or like on Google Translate. I haven't checked, but
Mm-hmm.
basically, do you remember the movie The Kingsman?
Yes.
And there was a phrase that they used a lot, which is "manners maketh man." That was like a big thing in that
Ah,
movie, "Manners
yeah.
maketh man," and it became very popular in Korea. And so man in Korean is namja, and manners is meno. And so meno namja became menonem, menonam, and that is like a man who has manners. A very like a gentleman, like
Oh,
a very polite. But it's not, they have a word for gentleman in Korean that
yeah.
pre-existed this movie. But
Yeah.
like things like that, I think are really interesting about languages and how they evolve and how new words are created
Yeah.
regularly. So because I love stuff like that, that was what really piqued my interest about Untranslatable. I thought it was really um, interesting and right up my alley. So,
Yeah, and I think for most people, like it's really funny because you I mean, I really created it because I needed it, and that
mm,
therefore I knew that other people needed it as well. Like I
right.
knew that it was like a hole in my life when I was, and so sometimes because I speak Spanish, but the thing about Spanish is that there's so many like varieties and things that often I'll like I know what these words mean, but I can tell that it's a reference to something,
Mm-hmm.
and that there's usually, so I can look up the translation, I can maybe even look up what it's a reference to, but I don't understand the cultural context around
Right.
it. And I
Like there's
want to
another
know.
layer there. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, you can tell, like, there's another layer, you just can't understand it quite.
Mm,
Or sometimes it's like, that's the thing. It's like the untranslatable aspect of like I know what these words mean, but together they mean something else.
mm-hmm.
And the other day I was watching a documentary, which is amazing, by the way. I think it was like nominated for an Oscar. It's called The Mole Agent about this.
Like MOLE?
Yes,
Okay.
yeah. It's about this like 80 something year old Chilean grandpa who goes undercover in a home for elderly people to like find out if there's like abuse and stuff, and then he
Whoa.
has to like, yeah, it's amazing. And but one
Wait,
of
you
the
said
things
it's a
they,
documentary.
yeah,
Wow. That sounds like.
no,
I
it's not.
immediately you described it and I was like, oh, that sounds like a fun movie.
No, it's a documentary,
Wow.
which makes it even more interesting.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, and then one of the people from the home talks about this guy, and obviously there's like a more, let's say, like I don't know, he still understands what's going on and stuff. And so she said about him that he like kind of that he was very like well spoken. He could talk about a lot of topics, and then she described that as saying tiene tema, like he has theme. And that was the way of saying like he's well spoken. He knows he can talk about a lot of themes or a lot of topics.
Ah, interesting. I would not
Yeah,
have got that
no, and
without
I
you
mean
explaining it.
obviously like the translation, if it's correct, and I think so, but and it's so funny because the woman just said, yeah, tiene tema, and the subtitles were like 2 sentences long. Like he was like he is able to talk about a lot of topics or something like that. And it was so interesting of like being able to just kind of, and it, like when you know it, it makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Like it's not completely strange or unnatural. But you
Mm-hmm.
have to know, and even like the word like tiene and tema, like they're not difficult words, but you have to know what they mean together. And then I asked a Mexican friend about it, and she was like, "I've never heard of that." But they say tiene verbo, like he has
Ah, verbs or
verbs,
words.
yeah, or like words, yeah. So, which also makes
Interesting.
sense. But again, like if someone says tiene verbo, like I don't know what that would mean,
Mm-hmm.
just separately.
Wow.
So, yeah.
The subtitle thing is something I've noticed. I watch a lot of, um, I watch French stuff and Korean stuff and Japanese stuff on Netflix quite a bit.
Mm-hmm.
And Korean always gets me because the Korean language is pretty succinct, I would say, in how they express certain things. And because once you've established the topic that you're talking about, you can drop the subject a lot of the time, like when you're
Mm-hmm.
forming your sentences. And so if I've already established that I'm talking about myself, like I say, my name is Angelique. Then the following sentence is I'm a teacher, I work for the government, I love movies. I don't have to say the I every time. I can just drop that part and just say work for the government, love movies, am a teacher. And so, with that in mind, I noticed that sometimes in watching a show, the character says, "what," which means
Mm-hmm.
why. Um, but the subtitle is not always just why. They give you the, like you were saying, they give you the context of why they've said why. So I'll give you an example. Do you remember that show when, well, you may not know, but there's a Netflix show, a
Uh-huh.
Korean drama called When the Camellia Blooms or something like that. And there's a scene in it, two women are talking. One woman says something or asks a question, and the other woman says, "What?" Like why, but like she doesn't say "we yo," which would be the polite.
Mm-hmm.
She just says "we," and she's talking to someone older than her, so it's deliberately impolite. So she says that, and the woman responds "we," and the subtitle says "why," but then the woman repeats herself, but she goes "we." It's the same word, but the subtitles say, "Did you seriously just ask me why?" That was what the subtitles were in English.
Amazing.
And
Yeah.
you would have, if you understood Korean and you knew what they were saying without subtitles, you would also get that. You would understand that that's
Yeah.
what she meant by why did you just ask, but in English we would have said, did you just ask me why? And so the
Yeah.
subtitle is sort of like not just a translation of the word, but also the meaning, the intrinsic
Yeah.
meaning of
Explain.
of
Yeah.
like that statement. I
That's
remember it was
amazing.
years ago when I saw it, but I still remember it because I just thought that's so wild that they would
Yeah.
take this way. Although I think in Korean they have that a lot. There are a lot of words where, depending on how you say it, it means like a whole sentence in English.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
There's
yeah,
like a lot of like information being given by the prosody of something. Like you just, yeah, that's so interesting.
yeah. So you
Yeah.
said you speak Spanish, right? Do you speak any other languages besides English
Um,
and Spanish?
well, Dutch, of course.
Right.
And I speak Portuguese as well. And I speak a language called Frisian, which is from
Frisian.
the, yeah, it's a minority language from the north of the Netherlands.
Okay. So are you from the north of the Netherlands, or your family is?
My mom is from there.
Okay.
Yeah, so it's kind of a thing where like yeah, I've had a lot of issues with this, but like I'm able to understand it fluently, but I don't really speak it in the sense that as a child, I didn't realize there was a difference between Dutch and Frisian.
Oh.
And so for me, it was just like whatever my family talked. And so I would just speak in Dutch and they would respond in Frisian and I could understand it and they could understand me. And so that was fine. And now that I
Huh.
get to an older age, I'm like the only person on that side of the family that doesn't speak Frisian. Um, and my dad as well. And so that's kind of a thing now where like, yeah, I just speak to them in Frisian and they kind of we go back and forth.
So
But
do
I
you,
do,
so you since learned Frisian, or
no, I'm trying
oh,
to.
you're
I'm
trying?
trying
Okay.
to at the moment. Yeah. Yeah. And it's quite interesting as well. Always take the opportunity to spread the word about Frisian. But because it's a minority language, not a lot of people know how to write it because they're just not taught. It's a very oral language. But with let's say language technology, and this is part of the reason why I started studying this, it has become easier because you have translators now. And so my mom, who is and all my aunts as well, who is fluent in Frisian, will translate, will write something in Dutch and translate it to a language that she also knows, just to see how it's written, or use like a keyboard that's able to correct her. So she'll write it and then it corrects her in the written form. Um, and that's how they kind of communicate now. So you start like they started with translating just words and then just kind of filling in the gaps with how phonetically you would say it. Um, and so slowly people are starting to write it more. And so I'm also in this process of trying to write it more. That can be quite difficult.
Wow, that is really interesting. As you were talking, it made me think of Jamaican English or Jamaican
Mm-hmm.
patois or Jamaican language. Different people have different names for it, but it's most commonly known as patois. Um, we have patois English dictionaries now. We have, I have it here actually. So we have something like, for example, like the Dictionary of Jamaican English,
Oh,
and
amazing.
if you look into it, fesoso means for so so, um, and it just means just as it is, plainly, simply, like fesoso, and that's it's cool for people like me because similar to
Mm-hmm.
you, I grew up not really speaking patois. I've had a conversation with my parents about this. I thought they were discouraging me from speaking patois because at the time, when I was a child
Mm-hmm.
in Jamaica, it was seen as sort of low class to speak
Yeah.
patois. And what and so I always thought I wasn't supposed to do it, and I was a very obedient child to my parents anyway, and so I didn't, and I didn't speak it at school. I didn't speak it anywhere. And then as an adult, I think I had a conversation with them where they said we weren't telling you not to speak it. We were just trying to make sure that you knew how to speak standardized English as well, or at a minimum, because if you cannot speak standard English, that affects your ability to get a job or be taken seriously or be seen as educated, et cetera, et cetera. And so that was sort of like not earth shattering, but it was like, oh wow, one of these sort of stories you tell yourself as a child, and then as an adult you realize it's all a lie,
Yeah.
or you misunderstood or whatever. But yeah, patois was typically a verbal, an oral language
Mm-hmm.
only until I'm going to say the person I most remember as starting to write it down was a poet whose name was Miss Louise Bennett,
Okay.
and she's like our pride and joy. And she's since passed
Mm-hmm.
away, but she wrote her poetry and her prose in patois, and she performed it
Mm.
in patois to sort of push the pride in this language that we created because patois was created from the enslaved Africans who were brought to Jamaica, excuse me, listening to the British plantation owners and trying to imitate not just the words but the pronunciation of the words. This is something I learned in like Caribbean history class in high school. That, for example, they would hear come here, which would be like sorry for the British accent, but an example of the British accent of come here. And then in trying to recreate that, it became kumya. And so kumya, which would be written differently, but kumya means
Yeah.
come here. And if you understand where it comes from, it makes a lot of sense. But now patois has its own linguistic, like grammatical structure, and like it's very. Some people say that there are no rules, but in fact there are, because
Yeah.
as someone who didn't grow up speaking patois but being able to understand it, the few times I speak it, I've been told I sound fake. I've been told that doesn't sound right. And you know when someone's not doing it right.
Yeah.
And if you can tell when someone's not doing it right, that means there's a rule. That means that there is a standard. So anyway, you talking about Frida
Yeah,
just
I mean,
made me think about
yeah,
that.
I that's such a yeah, I find that such a funny way that people like I wish linguistics was more taught in like high school and so that people would understand because I feel like this with a lot of my obviously I have a lot of linguist friends. But like the other day, for example, I was with some like non-linguist friends, and then you see that they have very like prescriptivist views, and the way they talk about language. It's just wrong because they'll say things like, "Oh yeah, there's no rules to this," and it's like if people are able to communicate, there's some type of rule because otherwise there is no communication. Like there's always a rule.
We would
It
not
might
know
just
what we're saying if there was none. Yeah.
yeah, just because someone didn't write it down or some like old white guy didn't teach it to you in school doesn't mean it's not a like there's no structure to it.
Just
Like
because it's not in a peer-reviewed journal.
yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah, and it's like this
Sorry. Just so,
it's
it
true,
was
right?
funny.
Yeah. And it's
Yeah, or
this
even
weird
who decides what constitutes as a language, right?
yeah.
Like the fact. So some Jamaicans, like myself, like my aunt, she's a historian. We both believe Jamaican is a language.
Mhm.
Patois is its own language, but there are a lot of Jamaican people who say no, it's not a language. It's a derivative of English. It's a dialect. It's a Creole. Um,
This
and
is
to me,
also
there's more evidence that it's a language. But
yeah, I mean when I hear about it, like it's sufficiently different from like I speak English, but I wouldn't be able to understand this and like the rules seem sufficiently different for
yes.
it to be like but yeah, of course like the consideration between what is a language and what is a dialect is for derivation is mostly political and things like
Yes.
that. So obviously there's not a even as linguists there's not a standard way to say this is a language, this is not.
Mm-hmm.
But I feel like there's definitely grounds for this to be considered a language. What's interesting as well is that this often let's say beyond like let's say colonial politics there's also an aspect of let's say the size of the language because what I often get first of all within the Netherlands there are a lot of people who think Frisian is a dialect of Dutch
Mm-hmm.
when in fact if you look at let's say the language tree it originated around the same time. It's actually more closely related to Old English.
Oh wow.
It's the closest related language to English, actually.
Frisian.
Yeah, yeah. So if you
That's
have
cool.
words, for example, like the word green, in Dutch we say groen, which like it's like GR vowel sound and then an N.
Oh, okay.
But in so like obviously you can see the languages are related, but in Frisian you say drieën, which is much more like it just
Yeah.
sounds like English with a funny accent. And so
Yeah.
it's like a yeah, and words like what else is there? Sweet, you say sweet, or there's a lot of words like church
Okay.
in Dutch and German. These words now start with a K, but in Frisian you say tjerke, so they kind of maintain that ch sound at the beginning, and you write it very differently, so that like if you see it written, you're like, what the hell is this? But if you
Okay.
hear it, yeah, it has maintained a lot of the same sounds as in English. And especially, I watched like a show that was set in Scotland or the north of England, and they'll say like, I'm not, no, I actually don't know how to say it, but instead of children, they say like barn, like ban or
Oh,
something.
Bairn. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's
And
like
they also, yeah.
BAIRN, something like that.
And
Yeah.
in Friesland, they say ben.
Oh.
just like that. And so when I heard that, I was like, wait, is that like a connection? And so that's, yeah, it's a very interesting, but it's
That's
because
cool.
it's a small language that people, and obviously it's had a lot of influence of Dutch over time, but it's definitely a different language by any standard,
Hmm.
let's say, available, if there would be one. Um, but just because it's smaller than Dutch, it's seen as a derivative of.
Hmm.
Um,
And I guess
and
because it's spoken in the Netherlands,
yeah, so
maybe
it
people are
must
like,
be.
therefore it must be some,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, yeah. And it's, I think it comes from this idea that like standard English or standard Dutch is the original and the rest is derivative, which is
Hmm.
not the case at all. You have all these different dialects, and then one of them is standardized, but they're not derivative of each other necessarily.
Hmm.
Like they could be, but they don't have to be. And then as a Dutch person, I often meet people who speak German, and the way that people who, and obviously these are not like, maybe they don't know a lot about these languages, that's fine. But let's say a lot of people assume that Dutch is also kind of, they say, oh, it's a mix of English and German, or it's
Hmm.
like from German. Like the way they often speak about it is like, oh, this sounds a lot like German, instead of saying, oh, German sounds a lot like Dutch.
Right.
If that makes sense.
Yeah.
And this is, and I think this also has to do with the size, like the way that people view it. Like, oh, German is much bigger, therefore it must be older and better,
Hmm.
and like,
And
it must be
Germany
the
is
original.
more popular, let's say, in
Yeah,
terms
yeah,
of
it's more prominent.
international awareness. More people
Yeah,
are aware of Germany. I'm very aware of
sure.
the Netherlands just because of, unfortunately, the transatlantic slave trade. They had a pretty big role in it, as small as the country is. And then, of course, it
Mhm.
also became popular when I was growing up for Amsterdam, and being able to smoke weed there and things like that. But you know what you were saying just now makes me think. I was thinking just that about like the different Scandinavian languages and how so many of them are so similar. I think, or someone who speaks one,
Mhm.
maybe they don't like, maybe they're Danish. So this is a random story. Do you know the TV show Taskmaster? It's a British
Yes,
show. Okay,
yes,
so
I
it's one
love
of my
it.
favorite shows. I
Yes,
love the show,
it's my
and
favorite as well.
yeah, they used to have Fred the Swede, right, as a recurring guest for a while,
Mhm.
and he. There was one challenge where they walked into the room and Fred was sitting there, and he was not allowed to speak in English. He was not
Mhm.
allowed to write in English. He was not allowed to spell anything in English. He could only speak Swedish. And they had to ask him a bunch of questions and figure out what his answers were. And Catherine Ryan, very smart, she's like, oh, I have a friend. She's Danish. Let me ask her.
Mhm.
And for most of the questions, her Danish friend was able to translate a lot of what Fred said in Swedish. And then for the stuff that she could, she used her phone, Google
Yeah.
Translate. I'm like, why didn't you use that in the first place? Anyway, um, and I was like, well, if you have like, why is it that Danish and Swedish are considered separate languages when there are so many similarities? Such that a Danish person could understand basic Swedish, but Patois or Frisian is considered a dialect. You know what I mean?
Yes.
Like like
Yeah,
you said,
yeah.
it's political and
It's the
it's
same with like
fascinating.
Croatian and Serbian. Like they're
Mm,
all very like intelligible among each other, but it's really just, yeah, political. Like this is, when all those countries like split up, they all were like, this is our language now,
hmm.
um, which is also fine. Like yeah, I don't have any issue with that, but I just wish that more people were like that accepting of smaller languages, or
Yeah.
they would just, let's say, understand it better. And I
Hmm.
understand, and I know why people don't, because yeah, when you go to school, it's very prescriptivist. It's very much like, this is what language is, and anything else is wrong.
Right.
And like for me, one of the biggest things like studying linguistics was when they obviously didn't say that things were wrong. They just say it's not grammatical. Like this is an agrammatical sentence.
Hmm.
And to me, that was like such a flip of like, oh yeah, because their grammar, obviously, there's like the standard English grammar.
Hmm.
And then if you say something in patois or I don't know, even like English, Southern
Yeah.
American English. It might not be the grammar of standard English. So in that case, it's agrammatical, but if you were to write another grammar, it might be incorporated in that, you
Yes.
know?
Yeah. Well, so in the U.S. they have AAVE, which is African American Vernacular
Mm,
English, which like relatively recently, I mean, in comparison to English, was considered its own language. Although some people consider it a dialect still because it has the word English in the title, but it has its own rules. And like even English slang has rules. Like I'm gonna do my homework. um,
mhm.
you wouldn't say I'm gonna to do my homework, or um, I want to go to the mall is not the same as um, I can't remember a good example now, but I remember when I was teaching ESL, a
Mhm.
student used wanna, um,
Mhm.
but it was like I knew it was wrong. And I was like, no, we wouldn't say that. And it's like, but
Mhm.
why? It's like,
Yeah,
because it
yeah.
doesn't work. Um, so I wanted to ask you a little bit about like, why did you start learning Spanish and Portuguese?
Oh, so I think in like somewhere in high school, I was just interested in, by the way, in Dutch, we all learn French and German in high school.
Oh, okay.
And so I have some knowledge of those languages, but not very good.
Mm,
And so I don't know, to me, Spanish was more interesting. And I ended up doing an exchange year in Panama when I was 16.
oh, cool.
Um, yeah, and that was really obviously like super immersive as well. So you learn it really well. And then when I came back, I wasn't quite sure what I wanted to do. So I did a bachelor in Latin American studies,
Okay.
because I was quite it's like starting to understand the continent in a way, but not quite. And I was like, I'd like to continue this.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And I had to choose between Spanish and Portuguese. And then I said, well, I guess I already like speak Spanish quite well. I would like to learn Portuguese just to have another language. And I actually, it was kind of random. Um, but I actually ended up loving it, and it was
Mm-hmm.
amazing. And yeah, I really love Brazil as well.
I was gonna ask
Um,
which
yeah, no,
Portuguese you
yeah,
speak.
because it's Latin American, obviously, it's
Right.
Brazilian Portuguese, and yeah, I also ended up doing an exchange for like 6 months in Brazil, which was amazing. And yeah, and I don't know, I think it's kind of random because when you're, I don't know, a teen, you get these random ideas, but they're not really based on anything. It's just like, something piques your interest and then you just start
Yeah.
with that. But now I feel very, yeah, I feel like in a way, in the same as English, in a way, they feel like my native language because I was like sufficiently young enough for that to be a part of my life, so to say, of my
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, like
Yeah,
under
not just in a
20.
classroom, but
Yeah, yeah,
yeah.
yeah. It's like an actual, yeah. And yeah, definitely like Spanish and Portuguese less so than English, but it definitely yeah, there's a type of feel very comfortable speaking those languages. And I kind of miss it when, because they say that you have like different personalities in each language. And so
It's true.
I kind of, yeah, I think it's true. And I realized that, like, because last year I lived in Spain.
Mm.
And so yeah, I could speak Spanish, although like Spanish from Spain is so different from Latin American Spanish that I had like Spanish friends, and we did the master together, and I would prefer to speak English to them because that was like the language we had for our master. And then when they spoke Spanish, it was like so different from mine that I just kind of felt like the odd one out.
Mm.
Like, I don't know, it kind of feels weird. And I kind of have the same thing with English now because I'm in London right now.
Mm.
And well, I speak more American English. And then if I'm in a crowd of only British people, I'm like, obviously there's no language we can switch to. And I feel like English, in a way, in English, I feel more comfortable in like international settings.
Mm-hmm.
But it's like so apparent that my way of speaking is so different from their way of speaking.
Yeah.
And that's sometimes kind of uncomfortable. But yeah, what I wanted to say about the personalities is that I'm studying in the Netherlands now, and I wasn't able to speak Spanish for a while, and I was like, I miss it because I miss that person who I am when I speak Spanish, right? Like it was kind of this part of me that wasn't able to express herself. And for a while, I just started like thinking in Spanish. And it was like kind of, I don't know, it was just kind of brewing in my mind the whole time because I had no outlet for it. Like I could write some friends, but there was no like, I don't know, no conversation in Spanish. And so I really started looking for people who spoke Spanish. And it was kind of like a desperate attempt to be like, I want to, I don't know, express this part of myself. Like it's a weird thing.
Yeah, like code switching, right? Like where we talk about it with for example, black people in North America in particular code switch a lot because there is like standardized way of communication, which is typically white, and then there is another way of speaking. So, for example, if you're a Black American and you use AAVE, as much as it is a legitimate language, it's still considered unprofessional, and so they wouldn't use it in at the workplace. And so in the workplace, they would use their standardized English, and their personality speaking standardized English is also softer and maybe more tightly bound or more private. You don't really share as much. And then when they switch to AAVE, it's a lot more relaxed and a lot more bold, maybe, and more straightforward, that kind of thing. So, yeah.
Can I ask a question about this? Because is this something um, that you were taught in university or
No.
okay? Because
So,
I
go ahead.
because I think that I've seen this a lot in like media, and I think it's very very good that this again like I wish more people knew about linguistics. But I think in linguistics, code switching is it's almost the opposite of that because code switching refers to and my university did a lot of research on code switching, but it's when you use two languages or two dialects within the same conversation. So it's often like Spanish like Mexican Americans, for example, who will use like interchangeably, like say pero like,
Right.
and then say things like that. And so that's like the code
Okay.
switching. And then I think what this thing of like Black Americans, it's more like register, right? Which because it's almost like a type of formality. Like if you go to the bank, you speak standard English, and it's like a formal type language. But then for informal, and I think there's also like languages where this, or sorry, countries where this is almost like I don't want to say standardized. So where
Like it's understood that in certain spaces you speak certain ways.
you speak this language is like one, even when you're I'm trying, I think I want to say that this is the case in Afghanistan, but I want to check.
Yeah, so
Um,
it may be one of those things where colloquially we use the term code switching, and maybe
yeah,
officially on paper that's not what it's
what
called.
it's called.
But
Yeah.
if you ask the average, I'm gonna say Black American or Black Canadian about code switching, uh, they would equate the two for whatever reason. They would just
Yeah,
say
yeah,
that
yeah.
basically
No, and
like I speak to these types of people this way, but I speak to these
this
types
way.
of people
Yeah.
this way. And when I'm in this kind of space, and I think it's not just I'm at work, it's I work with a lot of this type of people. And so when I'm around many of this type of people, I speak this
Yeah.
way and versus whatever. But that's
Yeah, no,
interesting. I think it's something that I should look into some more to understand why it is that we call it code switching if that's not
I
technically
think
what it is.
my and like I don't know. I think it's a nice term, right? Like it's an attractive word that kind of is like, oh yeah, we're switching, and it's codes. And I think, I mean, in a way, I like, does it matter what you call it as long as you understand it? No, not really. But as a linguist, I kind of wish that people would understand it because, in a way, I think register is a very interesting thing. And I wish more people would understand that because even white Americans do it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's just, let's say, the distance between the switching you have to do. So,
Mm-hmm.
whether that's, let's say, leaving out swear words to not leaving out swear words
Right.
to I'm changing my pronunciation to I'm changing grammar
Mm-hmm.
in the
Or
case of,
using contractions versus not using
yeah,
contractions. Yeah.
exactly. Or changing the language completely. Like with these people, I speak Chinese. With these people, I speak, like, I think there's like a Malaysian community where they speak like a Portuguese Creole.
Oh.
And then like in official places, they'll speak like different languages, you know? So like that's obviously a very big difference
Mm-hmm.
between what you speak at home and what you speak with your friends or something like that. And I think that's like a very interesting topic to explore. And then, but code switching is also because code switching might also happen with Black Americans, but it might be more of, for example, if someone is not very fluent in standard American English, or they kind of switch it up, like depending on the group they're in, like they
Mm-hmm.
might go between standard, or maybe someone who's biracial, who kind of grew up around both and they're mixing the two because
Mm-hmm.
they have trouble like separating the two.
Mm-hmm.
And I think code switching is also a very interesting topic that I wish more people in the US especially would know about because I think especially in minority communities like maybe Native American people, you know, who are not um, fluent in their native language
Mm-hmm.
and therefore have to code switch and have to use words from English because they don't know the word in their native language.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's like another thing that's like happening in minority communities. And so it's not, yeah, like the wording, it's kind of arbitrary, but I kind of wish that those two things would be like understood as separate concepts. And I wish like more people would understand these processes of like what's happening. Why am I, yeah, like why am I changing register? What is that? What are the consequences if I don't, you know?
Mm-hmm.
But also with code switching, like why am I substituting these words? Is it because I'm speaking with someone who is equally, because I will code switch when I'm speaking to someone who is both fluent in Spanish and English.
Mm-hmm.
When I don't know a word or like a certain, I don't know, like phrase is just
Mm.
like catchier in English, I'll just
Yeah.
use the English one and I'll kind of go back and forth. Um, and then, and there's a whole, like, it was in my previous university, they did a lot of studies in this. There's a whole thing about like, when do people switch? How do people, like when my grandfather, when we speak to each other, like I said, I'll speak Dutch. And he'll generally speak to me in Frisian, but sometimes he'll start a sentence in Dutch, and then midway, where the comma is almost, he'll switch to Frisian.
Hmm.
So it's almost this consistent, like, oh, I'll start speaking in Dutch, but then his Dutch is not that good. He's more fluent in Frisian, and so
Mm-hmm.
then he'll switch.
Cool. That's interesting. Yeah. I'm gonna write that down actually. Code switching versus register. So do you say that that is what I was describing is register switching, or is there
Yeah.
a term for it?
I think it's just register. I think it's just like the type of, yeah, like
Mm.
the type of register you use in what, and there might be more terminology because I'm also not, it's not like I know everything about this, but
Mm-hmm.
it's more, yeah, it's about what language or type of language I use in which space with which people, and what the formality of that is. Um,
Cool. Thank you. That's I usually come away from conversations needing to Google something. So I'm very
yeah.
pleased. I'm very pleased that we have this here, like code switching versus register, because when I teach ESL,
Mm-hmm.
register is something that I talk about, particularly in writing classes where I say, okay, well, if you're writing an email to a friend or if you're texting your friend, you use a different
Mm-hmm.
register than if you're writing an essay, right? So,
Yeah.
I never really considered that would also apply to what I was just describing.
Yeah.
Because I was more thinking about personality wise, like, when I speak a certain way, I have a more bold and direct personality versus when I speak another way, I'm a little bit more passive aggressive,
Yeah.
and a little bit less direct. Cool. Thank you very much for that. Okay, so I would like to thank you very much for your time as well. Thank you so much for, using up some of your time as you travel to speak with us today. Do you want to share like your social media handles and stuff for people to follow you?
Yes. So, as mentioned before, it's the Foreign Language Collective without the, so it's just at Foreign Language Collective on Instagram. I think it's the same on Facebook. For Untranslatable, it's at untranslatable.co. That's also the website, by the way, which is where you can really add words and see words that other people have added. So you can search things there. And it's, if some like cute or interesting expression or word comes to mind, please do add it to the website because that's kind of how we grow and get more information out there. Yeah, I think those are my professional handles, and I guess if you want to follow my personal one, it's just my name at Amarens, and that's it on Instagram.
You got just your name? That's lucky.
Isn't that cool? Yeah, yeah.
Very
It's
nice.
yeah, it's a whole story, but yeah, I'm pretty cool. Yeah,
Nice.
because I think I was like a teenager when I read about Instagram in an article. And then I was like, okay, I'll join. But it was before this was a social media, and I just entered my name, and then I got an account, and you could add like filters to it, and I was like, okay, cool. And then turned out it really paid off.
Yeah. It pays to get in there early.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
sure does.
when I made my first Gmail account, I thought Angelique Lazarus was too long of an email address that people wouldn't want to have to type out all of those letters. So I went for something much shorter. And then now as an adult, I wish I had because of course it's taken. But yeah, so it definitely pays. I know someone who has their first name at gmail.com, and I was like, man, you visionary.
Yeah, for
Yeah.
real. Yeah.
All right, so everyone, please do check out Amarens on Instagram and Facebook, and I will of course put all of the links in the show notes so that you can find them more easily. Amarens, thank you again so much.
Thank you for having me.